Did Jesus give the church secret instructions for the last days? And if so, why isn't anybody teaching it? Why does no one know about this? Are they actually the letters to the 7 churches of Revelation? Are these letters Jesus' specific instructions for the 70th week of Daniel? Or are they just historic letters to churches once located in Turkey that actually is good advice at any time? A lot rides on the answer. If they are prophetic of the future, their instructions almost no one is teaching. They truly are secret. The 7 letters are a favorite part of Revelation for pastors to preach on. They do contain what is good advice for every era, past, present, and future. And they give pastors an easy way to preach out of Revelation without actually getting involved in all that prophecy stuff. Plus, they are the direct words of Jesus. But what if these letters are part of that prophecy stuff? If they are advice to Christians during the last days, well, knowing what they mean and what we should be doing and when we should be doing it is critically important, something that no one or practically no one is doing. And if our pastors are mistaken about this, they are leaving the church totally unprepared for what is to come. This is not a trivial issue. It is an age-defining issue. Let's say that again and let it sink in. I hear a lot of teachers say if the church was going to face the tribulation period, why didn't Jesus give us specific instructions on how to do it? The answer may well be that he did, in plain sight in Revelation 2 and 3, but everyone is missing it. And if they are missing it, it is one of the greatest tragedies of all time in church history. We are missing the elephant in the room. But you do not have to miss this advice, this treasure. And in the next series of videos, we are going to first show why the letters to the 7 churches are indeed future instructions, and then unpack them one by one to show what they mean. So let's start by considering the main theories about the 7 churches right now. First is a theory that they are simply letters to historic churches in the 1st century that are good advice even for us today. Second is the theory that these churches might represent either historic church eras or what some call church ages. Third, that these are end-time churches, but that the letters are representative of church types now and during the end times. And finally, there is this theory. The theory that the letters are sequential, that they represent Jesus' advice to the one and only Church of Jesus Christ, as it endures 7 different events during the end times, specifically the 7 seals. Okay, let's start by looking at the last chapter of Revelation and something that has puzzled scholars for 2,000 years. The God of the spirits of the prophets sent his angel to show his bondservants the things that must soon take place. And behold, I am coming quickly. Blessed is he who heeds the words of the prophecy of this book. So Jesus said Revelation was prophecy, that these things would soon take place, and that he was coming quickly. To which we ask, really? Now, according to John's disciple Polycarp, Bishop of Smyrna, John wrote Revelation during the reign of the Roman Emperor Domitian, between 90 and 100 AD. So if Jesus was coming quickly then, in 90 AD, how is it that he hasn't come by now? This is a super difficult question. In the early church, it wasn't much of a question. But as the years went by, church leaders began to ask, hey, where's Jesus? And some began to come up with theories to explain Jesus' statement. Theories like Revelation had already been fulfilled. Augustine, who lived in the 4th century, is behind a lot of those ideas that still persist today. We call them preterism or historicism. These theories believe that the prophecies of Revelation were fulfilled long ago. However, it should be pretty obvious that the prophecies in Revelation aren't fulfilled. Just read the book. A third of the earth was not burned with fire at the first trumpet. And demonic locusts did not sting all of the wicked for 5 months, having them cry out for death, but death would not come. That was the fifth trumpet. And a third of the population of the earth weren't killed by fire and brimstone of a sixth trumpet. These things obviously have not happened. But then, how do we explain Jesus' statement that he is coming soon? The answer is actually very easy. In the same chapter we read, I, Jesus, have sent my angel to testify to you these things for the churches. Revelation was written for the churches, and when Jesus refers to the churches in this book, he means the 7 churches. At the beginning of the book, Revelation says the same thing. Write a book, what you see, and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, to Smyrna, to Pergamum, to Thyatira, to Sardis, and to Philadelphia, and to Laodicea. So, the book of Revelation was specifically written for these 7 churches. And depending on how you interpret them, depends on how you view Jesus' statement that he is coming quickly. If you think the letters are just historic, or if they represent church ages and history, then Jesus' statement about coming quickly might even be considered misleading. But if you believe the 7 churches are primarily about the end times, during the last 7 years, well, then that is a whole different story. Then Jesus' statement is completely accurate. He will be coming soon once the last 7 years begin, won't he? So that is one major reason to believe the 7 churches are end time only, not simply historic. But people ask, wait a minute, weren't the 7 churches historic churches in Turkey in 90 AD? And the answer is absolutely they were. There is no doubt about it. They were only 7 of the dozens of churches in Turkey in those days, and of the hundreds of churches worldwide that circled the Mediterranean, places like Antioch, Alexandria, Thessalonica, Pontus, Galatia, Corinth, Hierapolis, Colossae, Rome, Cyprus, and of course, Jerusalem itself. So why did Jesus address these epistles, these letters, to mostly smaller churches? In fact, Philadelphia was very small, rather than to the more major cities of his day. Some would say because, well, these were John's churches. In other words, John was the overseer of these 7 churches. But some of the larger churches, like Colossae or Hierapolis, were in the very next town to those smaller churches. So obviously, this choice of churches was for some other reason. John would have probably been the overseer of those other churches also. So maybe it was for symbolic or prophetic reasons. That doesn't prove a primary end-time connection just yet, but it at least proves Revelation was meant for more than just those 7 churches, and they were probably chosen for what they symbolized. Those who hold this historic view that the letters to the 7 churches were just good advice and were written just to those historic churches are usually surprised and puzzled after we answer these first 2 questions. There are also several places in Revelation where the translation of the Greek has been stretched to accommodate a view that the 7 churches are only historic. Yes, I said stretched, and by almost all translators. Let's look at the verse, Revelation 22:16, that we looked at previously. I, Jesus, have sent my angel to testify to you these things for the churches. Notice the footnote attached to the word for in your Bible. The reason there is a footnote is that the Greek word translated for doesn't mean for at all. It is the Greek word epi, which more properly means upon or about. The Young's literal translation is the only Bible translation that, in my opinion, translates this verse correctly as testify to you these things concerning the churches. Concerning the churches or about the churches. Wow, that changes everything about Revelation. So if all the things that happen in Revelation are actually concerning or about the seven churches, then the churches will exist in the future. And all the events in Revelation that we think don't involve these churches do involve these churches. Now, I can't answer for you why good-meaning Christian Bible translators would change a word that changes the whole meaning of the book of Revelation, but I think you should look at your Bible, look at the footnotes, see if what we're saying is correct, and then begin to have a more open mind to what the seven churches are about. However, this isn't the only place where a translation has altered the meaning of the seven churches. The second area where translators might have gotten a little bit too loose with Revelation is what many who think that the seven churches are simply historic consider their knockout punch. What about Revelation 1:19? Therefore, write the things which you have seen, the things which are, and the things which will take place after these things. This passage is always interpreted as defining Revelation into three areas. First, the things which you have seen, which is Jesus' appearance, his unusual appearance in chapter 1. The things that are, and by this they think it means the letters to the seven churches, which were things happening at the time of John, and then the things that will take place, meaning the future prophecy of the rest of the book. I bet that is exactly what you've been taught as well. And doesn't that part of the verse, the things that are, seem to imply that these letters are for only the historic churches? Now, I don't think anyone argues that the advice Jesus gave each church wasn't for that specific church. They were historic churches, and the advice was for them. But it can also be meant in a prophetic symbolic sense, a dual fulfillment. So let's keep exploring that. Plus, the verse we are looking at, Revelation 1:19, actually can be translated in a slightly different way. And almost no one is aware of that. The phrase, the things that are, is ha-asin in the Greek, which if you translate it literally, means the things that they are. In fact, noted New Testament translator Henry Alford translated this as the things they signify. And Meyer's New Testament commentary mentions the exact same idea. The way your Bible and my Bible translates this phrase, however, isn't the only way to translate it, as we just saw. And it probably is not the best way. However, that was the way that King James translated it in the 1600s. And that idea stuck and became tradition. And no major translation since has been willing to change the tradition, because it dramatically changes our eschatology. However, if we look at the 159 other uses of I seen in the New Testament, not one time is it translated the way your Bible translates Revelation 1:19. Not one other time. That should say something to us. The phrase, the things that are, found in your Bible and mine, is implied to mean the things that are currently existing. Currently existing is implied in the English. But is that true of the Greek? You would think that if this was a common Greek usage, that at least one or two other times in the entire New Testament, it would mean that same thing. But it doesn't. It never means that elsewhere in the Bible. This is probably pretty surprising to you, that a fundamental theory of revelation, in fact the one used to organize the whole book, might be mistaken. In fact, probably is mistaken. So I think we need to look at Alfred's literal translation of the phrase and see what Revelation 1:19 might really mean. If we pop Alfred's literal translation of the verse back in, it means something very different than what you've been taught. Therefore, write the things which you have seen and what they signify, and the things that will take place after these things. Instead of 3 different time periods, the verse only implies 2. Jesus' appearance and what each aspect of his appearance means, like his eyes of flaming fire and the 7 lampstands, etc., and then a second time period, the future prophetic aspect of the book of Revelation. But how does the context of Revelation 1:19 fit with this new translation? It fits perfectly. In fact, it fits much better. Because if we look at the very next verse, it seems to confirm Alfred and Meyer's translations. As for the mystery of the 7 stars, which you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. Jesus immediately begins to give meaning to the symbols. The lampstands are the 7 churches and the stars are their angels. Jesus is showing what the aspects of his appearance in John's vision signify. So now we have just proved that there is no biblical evidence that the letters to the 7 churches are strictly based on the past. So let's look at reasons the letters to the 7 churches might apply to an end time period. First, the letters, as most interpret them, are grossly out of place in Revelation, which is about the end times. What is advice to 7 local assemblies in the 1st century doing in an apocalyptic book? It's like a red M&M in a sea of blue ones. Second, the language used to write to these assemblies is distinctly apocalyptic. Unlike any other epistle in the Bible, symbolic language is used throughout, and some of the references mention specific end-time events. For instance, the letter to Thyatira mentions some of its members entering the Great Tribulation. Now that is only possible for those living in the end times, wouldn't you agree? Third, the order of Jesus' advice to these assemblies is not random, not at all, but it follows a distinct pattern that parallels what will happen during each of the 7 seals. In other words, the first letter matches the first seal, the second, the third, etc. Now this is a key understanding, which we're going to discuss in greater detail throughout this entire series on the 7 churches. And when you work through the entire series, your eyes will open and you'll say, oh, wow, I see it now. As an example, remember, we mentioned the Great Tribulation as part of the 4th letter, the letter to Thyatira. Well, the 4th seal is believed to be about the very start of that Great Tribulation, the abomination of desolation. So even this aspect fits perfectly. And of course, as we've already seen, Revelation 22 says the book of Revelation is prophecy. So this must include the letters to the 7 churches as well. So what about that church ages theory? That is a prophecy of sorts. Is it possible the letters are prophetic about various time periods in church history? Now, this is a very, very, very popular view. First, I would ask, what is the reference to the Great Tribulation doing in the fourth church age, long before the real Great Tribulation began? The answer is usually, well, maybe it's a symbolic usage of that word. A symbolic usage of a term, Great Tribulation, that only occurs 3 times in the New Testament? I don't think so. Second, look at this statement from that same letter, the letter to the church at Thyatira. Nevertheless, what you have, hold fast until I come. How is that possible for a church era that has long since passed and Jesus has not come? Makes no sense for this to be in a letter about a church age. And look at this very similar statement to the church at Sardis. Therefore, if you do not wake up, I will come to you like a thief, and you will not know at what hour I will come to you. How does that make sense for a church age that ended hundreds and hundreds of years ago? And in fact, in 6 of the 7 letters to the churches, a mention of the eschatological return of Jesus is made. As we stated before, how can this be related to historic church ages? They didn't experience the eschatological return of Jesus until they are resurrected. Also, was there ever an entire era of church history where the church was exempt from the hour of testing, and in which the Jewish synagogue of Satan came and bowed at their feet, as with the Church of Philadelphia? Well, obviously not. Also, if this 6th church, the Church of Philadelphia, truly is the church of the rapture, which many claim, why isn't it the last church age? Why is there another 7th church after it? To those calling our current church age the Church of Laodicea, which many do, which is that 7th church, I guess that means we all missed the rapture. But there are more reasons this theory doesn't fit. Such ages are assumed by each individual writer holding this theory and are totally arbitrary, with nearly every writer giving a different time period for their supposed age. If these 7 churches are truly types of church ages, they should be unique to that time period so that everyone was pretty much on the same page. But the truth is, all 7 types of churches existed in each of the so-called church ages, and they still exist today. There was never a time when one type of church was dominant. And if you happen to believe in the pre-tribulation rapture theory, you cannot also believe in this church ages theory. Did you know that? One cannot believe both. It's either or, because they contradict each other completely. I'm sure this is shocking to you, but the pre-tribulation rapture theory teaches something known as the theory of imminence. That not one prophecy has to be fulfilled prior to Jesus' return. Yet, if you believe in this church ages theory, this would have been a prophecy that needed to be fulfilled throughout the last 2,000 years. One cannot believe in imminence, which is necessary for pre-trib rapture theory to be true, and at the same time believe in the prophecy of the 7 church ages. They are completely inconsistent. You believe one way or the other. Either there are no prophecies needing to be fulfilled, or all prophecies need to be fulfilled. This brings up another very common theory associated with the pre-trib rapture theory that is related to these 7 churches of Revelation, so we'll bring it up here. That common proof is that the church is not mentioned in the book of Revelation after chapter 3 until after the return of Jesus. Proof, some say, of a pre-trib rapture taking the church out of this world prior to the tribulation period, and that is why they say the church is not mentioned. Now, if you do a word search, you find the word church doesn't appear in chapters 4 through 19 of Revelation at all. So is this proof correct? No, it is not, and let me explain why. In the book of Revelation, the word church is never used to refer to the universal church of Jesus Christ, the ecclesia, the assembly of called out ones. It always refers to a specific one of the 7 churches, like the church of Ephesus, the church of Philadelphia, etc., or it refers to all 7 of these churches at one time. It doesn't refer to the universal church throughout the world. So the term church isn't used for the universal church, but for a group of specific churches. When John wants to refer to believers in Jesus, he calls them saints or bondservants, to which some will say, those are only tribulation saints, those that come to faith during the tribulation. But can we make that assumption? Look at these famous verses from chapter 19 of Revelation. The marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. It was given to her to clothe herself in fine linen, bright and clean, for the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. There's the word saints. No one would argue that the church is part of the bride of Christ, yet here the bride adores herself with the righteous acts of the saints. And since this verse is in Revelation, and some want to tell us that the word saints in Revelation are only tribulation saints, are these the righteous acts of tribulation saints only? Is there anyone who believes the bride only adorns herself with the righteous acts of tribulation saints? And that those in the church era don't have righteous acts worthy of the bride? We know this is nonsense. So when you read the word saints in Revelation, it means believers in Jesus, those who believed prior to the 70th week, and those who became believers after the 70th week. This brings us to one final theory, that the 7 churches are present in the 70th week of Daniel, just as we surmise, but that they all coexist at the same time. They're all on the earth at the same time. That every believer on earth finds themselves in one of these, quote, spiritual churches. That they are types of people, not really assemblies. This theory was proposed by 119 Ministries, whom I happen to really enjoy, and a link to their video is found down in the description if you want to view it at the conclusion of this video. Of all the theories thus far, I like this one the best, but it falls short for 3 reasons. First, we alluded to it just a moment ago, that each of the 7 churches are called churches or ecclesia, the assemblies of called out ones. Saying each individual in the world is divided into one of them defeats this very idea of an assembly, which means they are assembled or collected into one of them. In this theory, they are scattered and divided. Second is that, as we saw, each church is a golden lampstand or menorah. Now, in the tabernacle which Moses built based on God's heavenly standard, there was one and only one lampstand. So how could there be 7 all at one time? Now, some might argue that these 7 are only the lamps on the top of a single menorah or a lampstand. A menorah with 7 lamps. But that is not the language used in Exodus when Moses was instructed to make the lampstand. Then you shall make a lampstand of pure gold, and you shall make its lamps 7 in number, and they shall mount its lamps so as to shed light on the space in front of it. See that you make them after the pattern for them which was shown to you on the mountain. As you just saw in Exodus, there is a strict distinction between lampstands and lamps. And in Revelation, the churches are specifically called lampstands. So either there are 7 menorahs all at one time, or there are 7 but entering and leaving the scene one at a time, so that there's only one lampstand on the earth at any given time. I favor that second view because it was the heavenly pattern shown to Moses on the mountain, one and only one lampstand at a time in the tabernacle. And the picture you just saw of the 7 menorahs all at one time was very difficult to find, because everyone realizes 7 menorahs at one time make 0 biblical sense. Rather, the artists usually picture it as a single menorah with 7 lamps, like this, that we just showed was incorrect. Or the artists picture 7 candlesticks. Yet the Old Testament word for lampstand is menorah, a 7-branched candlestick. It is obvious John is referring to this, 7 menorahs, each with 7 lamps, which only makes sense if they enter and leave the scene one at a time. And finally, and most importantly of all, the instructions given to each church are precisely what believers should be doing during each one of the 7 seals. The instructions given to Ephesus match those that should be given to believers during the first seal, Smyrna during the second, Pergamum during the third, etc. And this is very precise and in exact order. So our theory is the 7 churches are the one and only Church of Jesus Christ, as it endures and overcomes each of the seals in exact order. The letters or epistles to the churches are believers' specific instructions during each one of the seals. To which you are probably thinking, really? I want to know those instructions. If so, click right here to keep watching, and we will show you the instructions to the churches of Ephesus and Smyrna, the first and second seals. And if you haven't subscribed yet, be sure to do so and click the bell notification in order to be notified when each and every new video is put out, just like this one. This is Nelson, and I'll see you there.